Welcome to English Crime Files. Behind closed doors, every detail leaves a trace, and every case holds a deadly secret. Today, we open a new file. The Gilded Lie. She was a young woman from a modest, conservative family, raised in a small, sun-bleached town on the edge of the fertile plains. A household of brothers and sisters, of a father who worked with his hands and a mother who kept the home with a quiet, unshakable dignity. It was a family where the values ran old and the walls ran solid. Honor, modesty, the sanctity of a promise. They were not wealthy, but they were respectable, and in their world, respectability was a currency more precious than silver. The girl, whom we will call Samira, grew up in that house, the rhythm of her days marked by school, chores, and the watchful eyes of her parents. She was not a brilliant student. Her path through the classroom ended before the final exams. Her academic ambitions quietly extinguished by circumstance rather than choice. And so, like many young women of her background, she returned to the family home to wait for the life that would be chosen for her, the life that would begin, as it so often did, with a knock on the door. The knock came when she was 22. A young man from a neighboring town, employed, steady, with a reliable income and a reputation for good character. He arrived with his parents, as tradition dictates, and they sat in the family salon drinking mint tea and making polite conversation while Samira served the tray, her eyes modestly downcast. His name was Tariq. He was not a glamorous man, but he was solid, a man who worked hard, who had a gentle word, a man who could be counted on. Her parents made their inquiries and found nothing but praise. He was suitable. He was safe. The engagement was agreed, the marriage contract signed, and the wedding celebrated with music and ululating joy. Samira moved into Tariq's small but comfortable home, and for a time, life was as good as anyone could reasonably hope for. The first year passed in the warm, hopeful haze of new marriage. Then the second, she fell pregnant, and Tariq showered her with the kind of attentive care that turns an ordinary pregnancy into a cherished memory. Her family lived close by, a constant, reassuring presence. She gave birth to a daughter, and the house filled with the sweet chaos of a newborn. 2 years later, a second daughter arrived, another blessing, another reason for the young family to gather and celebrate with couscous and prayers of thanks. Tariq worked long hours, but he provided. He never raised his voice. He handed over his salary for the household expenses without hesitation. Samira had, by every measure available to a woman in her world, everything: security, children, a husband who respected her. She was, by every reasonable account, fortunate. And then, as so often happens in stories like this one, the serpent entered the garden. He was a government employee working in the same town, a man whose clerical post afforded him a certain self-important air. He saw Samira one day, perhaps in the street, perhaps on her way to the grocer's, a young mother with her child in tow, and something dark and obsessive clicked into place behind his eyes. He began to watch her. He learned her routines: the morning trip to the preschool, the afternoon walk to collect her daughter, the errands, The visits, the quiet, unguarded moments when she was alone. He lingered outside the cafe near her home, his newspaper unread, his gaze fixed on her doorway. He followed her, not with the clumsy desperation of a lovesick boy, but with the cold, patient calculation of a predator studying his prey. Samira, for her part, did everything right. She noticed his attention and shut it down completely. She would not meet his eyes. She did not respond when he tried to speak to her in the street. When he approached, she turned away. When he pressed a scrap of paper with his phone number in her hand, she let it fall as if it had burned her. She was a married woman, and she conducted herself like one. But this man, let us call him Hassan, was not deterred by a locked door. He was fascinated by it. The very fact that she was married, that she belonged to another man, only sharpened his hunger. It was not her beauty that obsessed him. It was her unavailability. He was a man who wanted, above all else, what did not belong to him. When the direct approach failed, Hassan changed tactics, and this time, far more insidiously. He set out to become friends with Tariq. He discovered the cafe where the unsuspecting husband unwound after work. A simple place of plastic chairs, muddy coffee, and talk of football and rising prices. Hassan began to appear there, always at the same hour, always with a friendly smile. He introduced himself. He paid for Tariq's coffee. He laughed at his jokes. Day by day, week by week, he wove himself into the fabric of Tariq's life, presenting himself as a bachelor, a man alone in the world, hungry for companionship. Tariq, good-natured and trusting to a fault, saw no danger in him at all. He saw only a new friend. Soon, Hassan was invited to the house. The first time was for Friday couscous, a gesture of hospitality deeply woven into Moroccan custom. Hassan presented himself humbly, complimented Samira's cooking, and treated her with the careful formality of a guest. But in the brief moments when Tariq's back was turned, his eyes would flick toward her, a flash of knowing hunger beneath the mask of courtesy. The visits grew more frequent. Hassan would drop by in the evenings, and Tariq, ever the generous host, welcomed him without a second thought. Samira served the food while Hassan sat at the table, a wolf who had talked his way into the fold, breaking bread with the very family he intended to destroy. It was a slow, calculated siege, and slowly, imperceptibly, the walls Samira had built began to crumble. The resistance she had so fiercely maintained out in the street dissolved in the false intimacy of her own home. She began to see Hassan differently. He was there, always there, attentive and present while her own husband toiled through long hours at work. He spoke to her with a warmth and flattery that Tariq, worn thin by fatigue, no longer thought to offer. He painted pictures of another life entirely, a life of luxury, of gold, of freedom. He whispered promises. "Leave him," he would murmur, his voice low and urgent. "I will marry you. I will give you everything. You deserve more than this." And Samira, a young woman who had never known anything beyond the quiet boundaries of her family and her neighborhood, began, despite herself, to listen. The devil is a patient negotiator, and he always knows your price. For Samira, the price was the illusion of a grander life, a life where she was no longer simply a mother and a wife stretching a modest salary, but a cherished queen. The affair began, furtive, desperate, conducted in stolen moments and whispered phone calls. She hid it from her family, from her neighbors, and above all from her trusting, oblivious husband. It was not long before Hassan made his demand. Divorce him. He said it with the calm assurance of a man accustomed to getting his way. Divorce him, and we will marry. I will give you the world. Samira, by then utterly intoxicated by his promises, agreed. She began picking fights with Tariq, inventing grievances where none existed, sowing chaos in a home that had once been a sanctuary. Her family, bewildered and heartbroken, tried to intervene. Her father, a man of deep principle, could not fathom what had possessed his daughter, but she was deaf to their pleading. She wanted out. She wanted the life Hassan had promised her. Tariq, decent even in the face of betrayal, eventually bowed to the inevitable. He did not rage. He did not fight. He simply looked at the woman he loved, the mother of his children, and said, "If this is what you want, I will not stand in your way." They went to court. The divorce was finalized by mutual consent, a clean, cold severing of a bond that had once run warm. Custody of the two little girls rested with Samira at first, but her new life proved too chaotic, too unstable, and in time the girls went to live with Tariq and his mother, the quiet, steadfast family Samira had so recklessly cast aside. Samira moved in with Hassan, not as a legally wedded wife, but under the fragile, informal arrangement of a Fatiha marriage, a religious ceremony carried out without civil registration. It was a promise, and nothing more. Hassan told her it was the only way for now. Complications at his work, bureaucratic hurdles, the need for discretion. He would make it official later, he swore. She believed him. She needed to believe him. She had burned every bridge behind her, and the only path left ran straight into his arms. And so, in a small rented house in that same town, Samira began her new life. She had left behind a loving husband, 2 beautiful daughters, and the respect of her family. She had traded all of it for a phantom, a mirage painted in whispered promises. She did not yet know that the man now sharing her bed was concealing a fundamental truth, a wife and children of his own, living quietly in another city. She did not know that the life of gold and comfort he had promised her was pure fiction, a lure built to reel her in. And she could not possibly have imagined that, within the year, this man, this predator who had stalked her, manipulated her, and pulled her from her family, would raise a heavy iron crowbar and bring it down upon her skull, ending her life in a single moment of cold, brutal rage. The evidence of that final, terrible act sits before me now on this desk. The crowbar, sealed in plastic, its dark stains a silent testimony. The handbag she was carrying the night she vanished. The wedding ring she still wore, hanging from a chain around her neck. And the photograph of a drainage ditch, a lonely, stinking place on the outskirts of town, where her body was found, discarded like refuse. This is the story of how a simple, respectable woman became the victim of a predator's obsession, and how the lies that built her new world collapsed into a nightmare of murder. The house Samira moved into was a modest rental on a quiet street. a place of temporary arrangements and thin walls. It was nothing like the palace of gold and comfort Hassan had painted during those whispered conversations, but she had already sacrificed everything for this man, and the human mind is a masterful architect of self-deception. She told herself this was merely a stepping stone, that the promises would still be fulfilled, that the legal marriage would come in time. All she had to do was be patient. But patience is a fragile thing when you begin to sense the truth rotting beneath the surface. The first cracks appeared as delays. Every time Samira pressed Hassan about formalizing their union, the official contract, the papers, the recognition before the law, he had an answer ready. His work required a transfer first. The administration was slow. His family needed time to accept a divorced woman. The excuses piled up like dead leaves, each one burying the last, and Samira, once so certain, began to feel a cold dread settle in her stomach. She started watching him more carefully, the tone of his phone calls, the ones he took in the other room, his voice dropping to a murmur. The weekends he vanished entirely, claiming work in distant towns. The serpent who had coiled himself around her life was now revealing the scales she had refused to see. Driven by a desperate need for the truth, Samira did something she had never done before. She began investigating the man for whom she had thrown away her old life. She reached out cautiously to people who knew him, colleagues from his workplace, acquaintances around town, friends of friends. She asked careful, indirect questions, piecing together a portrait from the fragments she gathered. And the portrait that emerged bore no resemblance to the one she had been sold. Hassan was married. He had a wife and children living in another city, a family he visited regularly while telling Samira he was away on business. The woman he had promised to marry, the woman he had lured from her husband and children, was nothing more than a hidden mistress, tucked away in a rented house like a shameful secret. The gold, the comfort, the promised life of luxury, all of it fabrication. He was in truth a mid-level clerk on a modest salary, a man who could barely support one household, let alone two. When Hassan returned to the house that night, he found a different woman waiting for him. The quiet, hopeful Samira had been replaced by fury. She confronted him with everything she had uncovered, her voice rising, her hands shaking. The neighbors, those unwilling witnesses, separated only by thin plaster, heard the eruption. They heard the accusations, the screaming, the sound of objects hitting the walls. They heard a woman's voice, raw with betrayal, and a man's voice, first offensive, then furious, then roaring back. The fight that night grew so violent that the neighbors, fearing for Samira's safety, called the police. When the officers arrived and knocked, a long, loaded silence passed before Hassan opened the door. Both he and Samira bore the marks of the struggle, scratches, bruises, a cut above Samira's eyebrow. The officers separated them and took statements on the spot. Hassan, ever the performer, tried to wave it away as a simple domestic dispute. Samira, trembling and bleeding, demanded to file a formal complaint for assault. But an inconvenient legal truth complicated everything. They were not, in the eyes of the state, married at all. Their Fatiha union carried no civil weight. Once the public prosecutor was alerted to this fact, the matter shifted entirely. Both were taken into custody, Hassan on suspicion of adultery, since his legal wife remained very much a part of the record, and Samira on a charge of complicity in an unlawful relationship. The legal machinery, once engaged, proved pitiless. Hassan's legal wife was summoned and given the choice of pressing charges against her husband for infidelity. But she, a mother with children of her own to protect, chose forgiveness, at least in the eyes of the law, and withdrew the complaint, sparing him prosecution. Samira had no such protector. She stood trial for debauchery, for living with a married man outside the bounds of lawful marriage, and was sentenced to 2 months behind bars. She served her time in a cold cell, the iron bars a brutal metaphor for the cage her life had become. When she emerged, she was a woman stripped of everything: her husband, her children, her reputation, and now her freedom. She returned to her parents' home, but the welcome she found was not the one she remembered. Her father, a man of the old ways, could barely bring himself to look at her. The shame she had brought upon the family was a stain he feared could never be scrubbed clean. He did not cast her out. She remained his daughter, his blood, but he imposed strict conditions. She was not to leave the house. She was not to use the telephone. She was to live quietly, almost invisibly, a penitent haunting the rooms of her childhood. And for a time, she accepted this. She changed her phone number. She severed all contact with Hassan. She tried, desperately, to gather the shattered pieces of her dignity. But Hassan was not finished with her. He still had the phone number of Samira's sister. He reached out to her, not with threats, but with a new and insidious charm offensive. He sent gifts, or rather photographs of gifts, images of expensive jewelry and fine clothing, luxury items lifted straight from the internet. He told the sister he was a changed man, that he could not go on without Samira, that he wanted, more than anything, to make things right. He begged for one meeting, just one chance to talk. The sister, perhaps swayed by the glittering images, perhaps simply worn down by months of family drama, passed the messages along. And Samira, isolated, broken, and still nursing the faint, stubborn hope that her sacrifice had not been entirely in vain, agreed to see him. They met at a cafe, chosen as neutral ground. Hassan was contrite, persuasive, devastatingly tender. He admitted to his lies, but framed them as the desperate acts of a man too in love to bear losing her. He promised, once again, to fix everything. The gifts he had sent, they were real, he swore, waiting for her back at the house. He had bought her gold. He had bought her everything she deserved. All she had to do was come home. Samira, against every instinct, against every hard lesson the previous months should have taught her, believed him. She returned to the rented house with him that very evening. The house was quiet when they arrived. Hassan told her he had errands to run, some work to finish, and that he would be back soon with the gifts he had promised. He left, and Samira waited. The hours crawled by. Darkness fell. When he finally returned, it was late, and Samira, who had spent those hours clinging to the last threads of her hope, demanded to see the gold, the clothes, the proof that this time was different. And Hassan, cornered at last and exhausted by the weight of his own lies, told her the truth. There was no gold. There were no gifts. The photographs he had sent were stolen from the internet. A desperate ruse to lure her home. He had needed her. He could not bear to be without her. That was the whole of it. The confession landed like a slap, and Samira, betrayed, imprisoned, and humiliated by the very system that should have protected her, finally broke. She screamed at him, her voice cracking with fury. She called him a liar, a coward, a destroyer of lives. She hurled at him every ounce of pain she had carried since the day she first laid eyes on him. The argument that followed was not the kind that ends in slammed doors and tearful reconciliation. It was the kind that jolts neighbors awake in the dead of night, that presses their ears to the walls with wide, frightened eyes. They heard furniture crash, dishes shatter, the raw, animal sounds of two people locked in a death spiral of rage. And then, in the chaos, Hassan's hand closed around a heavy iron crowbar, a tool for prying open crates, left carelessly in a corner of the house. He swung it. The blow caught Samira in the head, a sickening, wet crack that silenced her mid-scream. She crumpled to the floor, her body limp, blood pooling beneath her. The woman who had once been a daughter, a wife, a mother of two little girls, lay dead on the cold tiles of a rented house, killed by the very man who had promised her the world. Hassan stood over her body, his breath heaving, the crowbar still clenched in whitened knuckles. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a cold, crystalline panic. He had killed her. He had not planned it. The crowbar was no part of any scheme, but she was dead, and he was alone with what he had done. The mind of a killer, in such moments, does not turn to remorse. It turns to survival. He had to dispose of her, and he had to do it in a way that could never be traced back to him. He waited until the deepest, darkest hour of the night, when the street lay empty and the neighbors had at last, uneasily, drifted into sleep. He wrapped Samira's body in a bedsheet, carried it out to his modest car, and laid it in the trunk. He drove through the sleeping town, past shuttered shops and darkened windows, until he reached the outskirts. There he found what he was looking for, a new housing development still under construction, a scar of churned earth and half-finished concrete shells, and, crucially, a deep drainage channel, one of the concrete-lined conduits built to carry away sewage and stormwater. The stench there was already foul, thick enough to mask almost anything. He dragged the body to the edge and rolled it into the darkness. It landed with a wet, heavy thud, swallowed whole by the filth and shadow below. He drove home, cleaned the house, and resumed his life as though nothing at all had happened. He went to work the next morning, greeted his colleagues, drank his coffee. He had erased Samira as thoroughly as if she had never existed. But Samira's family, who had watched her descent with a mixture of anger and desperate love, noticed her absence almost at once. They had never approved of her return to Hassan, but she remained their daughter, their sister. When her phone rang and rang without answer, when one day became two, then three, their worry hardened into cold, grim certainty. Something was wrong. On the seventh day, Her sister went to the rented house and knocked. No answer. She went to Hassan's workplace and asked for him directly. He came out, calm and composed, and offered a story. They had met at a cafe, he said, and argued. Samira had refused to return to the house with him. She had stormed off, and he had not seen her since. Perhaps, he suggested, she had gone back to her family, too ashamed, maybe, to show her face. But the family knew Samira had not come home, and they knew, with a bone-deep instinct, that Hassan was lying. They went to the Royal Gendarmerie and filed a missing persons report, naming without hesitation the man they believed had destroyed their daughter's life. The gendarmes, seasoned men who had heard every shade of human deceit, began their investigation methodically. They summoned Hassan for questioning. He repeated his story with practiced ease. The cafe meeting, the argument, her sudden departure, no contact since. He was cooperative, polite, the very picture of a concerned ex-partner. But the officers had already begun canvassing the neighbors, and the picture that emerged there was starkly different from Hassan's carefully rehearsed account. One neighbor, a man living directly beside Hassan's house, told the officers something crucial. About a week earlier, he had seen Samira arriving with Hassan, the two of them climbing the stairs together. He was certain of the date, he said, because it coincided with his son's birthday. He had just come home with the cake. A second neighbor, a woman, reported that Samira had knocked on her door that same evening asking to borrow salt for the dinner she was preparing. Salt, a small domestic detail that placed her unmistakably inside the house on the very night she supposedly vanished. A third neighbor, whose bedroom wall backed directly onto Hassan's living room, recounted the fight in detail. The screaming, the crashing, and then the terrible, sudden silence. They had not called the police that particular night, reluctant to involve themselves in another of the couple's volatile disputes, but they had heard everything, and they remembered it clearly. Armed with these testimonies, the gendarmes confronted Hassan with the contradictions. His calm facade began to crack. He stammered, backtracked, tried to suggest the neighbors had confused the dates. But the net was closing. The officers secured a warrant to search his home, and there they found Samira's handbag, a simple leather bag her mother identified without hesitation, the one Samira had been carrying the night she left her parents' house for the last time. Inside it, a hairbrush, a small purse, a house key. They also found some of her clothing, hastily stuffed into a closet. And in a corner, wedged behind a cabinet, they found a crowbar, a heavy iron bar whose surface still bore the faint, telltale traces of blood. The evidence was damning. The neighbor who saw them arrive together, the woman who lent the salt, the couple who heard the fight through the wall, the handbag, the clothes, the crowbar. Hassan was led back to the gendarmerie post, his composure now entirely gone, his lies laid bare in the harsh light of undeniable fact. The interrogation room was a small, windowless box, its walls painted a sickly institutional green, its only furnishings a metal table bolted to the floor and 4 hard plastic chairs. The fluorescent light overhead hummed a monotonous, grating note that seemed engineered to fray the nerves. And on this particular afternoon, in this particular room, a man who had spent months, weaving an intricate web of lies, was about to watch it all come apart. Hassan sat on one side of the table, his hands loosely cuffed before him, his posture still carrying the faint residue of defiance. The lead investigator, a captain with tired eyes and an unreadable expression, sat opposite, a thick manila folder placed deliberately between them. He did not open it right away. He let it sit there, a silent, weighty presence, as he poured himself a glass of water from a plastic bottle. The only sound in the room was the glug of the water and the distant, muffled clatter of a typewriter from somewhere down the hall. The captain took a slow sip, then set the glass down with a deliberate click. "You told us," he began, his voice calm, almost conversational, "that you last saw Samira at a cafe, that you argued, that she left, and you never saw her again. Is that correct?" Hassan nodded, jaw tight. "Yes, that is exactly what happened. I have already told you this." The captain nodded thoughtfully, as though weighing the account with genuine open-mindedness. Then he opened the folder and drew out a single sheet, a sworn statement, signed with a neighbor's careful hand. "Abderrahim, who lives in the apartment directly beside yours, states that he saw you and Samira entering the building together on the evening in question. He watched you climb the stairs. He recognized her without doubt. He remembers the date precisely because it was his son's birthday, and he had just come home with a cake." The captain let the detail hang in the air. A birthday cake. People tend to remember those. Hassan's throat moved. He is mistaken. It was a different day. Maybe the week before. She was still living with me then. The captain did not argue the point. He simply drew out a second statement. "Fatima, across the hall, says Samira knocked on her door that same evening. She asked to borrow salt for the tagine she was making. They spoke face to face. Fatima asked how she was doing. A pause. Do you remember what you ate that night, Hassan?" Hassan's eyes flickered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again without a word. The captain pressed on, his tone still utterly without aggression. A patient teacher correcting a slow student. "And then there is Mr. and Mrs. Eladrissai, whose bedroom shares a wall with your living room. They heard the argument. They heard the shouting. They heard things breaking. And then they heard one loud, heavy thud, followed by total silence." The captain leaned in slightly. "They didn't call us that night. They regret that now. But they heard everything." The folder yielded still more. Piece by piece, the captain built a wall of fact around the trapped man. Samira's handbag, recovered from his closet and identified by her mother without hesitation. Her clothing, folded hastily into hiding. And then, the final and most damning piece. The captain reached beneath the table and produced a large, clear evidence bag. Inside, heavy and dark, lay the iron crowbar. Even through the plastic, the faint rust-colored stains along its curved edge were unmistakable. "This was found wedged behind a cabinet in your home," the captain said, his voice dropping to something close to a whisper. "Our forensic team has already examined it. Those stains are human blood. Further testing is underway, but I believe we both already know whose blood it is. Don't we, Hassan?" The silence that followed was absolute. It held for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Hassan stared at the crowbar, his face shifting through a ghastly landscape of emotion. Fear, calculation, and finally, a slow and total resignation. The wall of lies he had built so carefully, maintained for so long, collapsed all at once. His shoulders sagged, his head dropped, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a broken, ragged thing, stripped bare of all pretense. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered. "I loved her. I loved her more than anything. But she wouldn't stop asking. The gold, the things I promised her. I had to tell her the truth. And when I did, she went wild. She attacked me. She was screaming, throwing things at me. I picked up the crowbar. I don't even remember deciding to. I just swung it. Once. And then she was on the floor." The captain listened without expression as Hassan recounted, in grim detail, the hours that followed. How he had stood over her body in a daze, the crowbar still in his hand. How he had waited for the deepest, darkest part of the night, when the street lay silent as a tomb. How he had wrapped her in a sheet, carried her to his car, and driven out to the edge of town. And then, the final degrading act. How he had dragged her body to the lip of a deep drainage channel at a half-built housing site and rolled her into the foul darkness beneath, hoping the stench of the drain would cover the smell of what was to come. The confession was recorded, signed, and witnessed in full accordance with the law. The public prosecutor was notified without delay. The following morning, beneath a gray and indifferent sky, a convoy of official vehicles made its way to the construction site Hassan had described. The gendarmes cordoned the area off with yellow tape. The scientific police arrived in their white overalls, and the civil protection officers, men trained for the very worst humanity could produce, descended into the fetid dark of the drainage channel. The recovery of Samira's body was a slow, grim operation. She had lain there for more than a week, and the elements, combined with the foulness of her surroundings, had done their terrible work. When the remains were finally lifted to the surface, they were in an advanced state of decomposition. But the forensic pathologist, conducting his preliminary examination at the scene, confirmed what the confession had already made clear. The cause of death was a massive skull fracture consistent with a single, heavy, blunt force blow. The crowbar, now sealed and tagged as the case's primary physical evidence, matched the wound pattern precisely. Samira's body was transported to the morgue for a full autopsy. The detailed report, when it reached the captain's desk days later, added a final, clinical layer of certainty to the case. The blow had been delivered with tremendous force, causing immediate and catastrophic damage to the brain. Death, the report concluded, would have been instantaneous or very nearly so. There were no other significant injuries beyond those consistent with the brief struggle Hassan himself had described. The findings corroborated his account in full. A single, fatal moment of violence, followed by a cold and calculated cover-up. With the confession on record and the forensic evidence aligned, the legal process moved swiftly into its next phase. Hassan was brought back to the crime scene under heavy guard for the formal reconstruction of the murder, a standard procedure in Moroccan criminal investigations, designed to verify the accused's own statements and provide the court with documented, visual proof. The street outside his former rental home was once again sealed off. Neighbors gathered behind the police tape, their faces caught somewhere between horror and grim vindication. They had heard the screams. They had given their statements. Now, they watched as the man who had lied to them all was led, shackled, back into the house he had once welcomed as a guest. Inside, a court photographer documented every gesture. Hassan, his voice flat and emptied of feeling, walked the investigators through the sequence of events. He showed them where Samira had stood when she confronted him. He demonstrated how he had reached for the crowbar, how he had swung it. He pointed to the spot on the floor where she had fallen, where her blood had pooled and soaked into the cheap ceramic tile. From the house, the convoy moved on to the construction site. There, standing at the edge of the drainage channel, Hassan described in the same hollow monotone how he had dragged her body to the edge and let it fall into the darkness. The photographs from that session, the killers standing over the concrete channel, the forensic team gathered close, the captain observing with a stone-cold expression, would become a central exhibit in the court's dossier. The case file, now thick with witness testimonies, forensic reports, the autopsy findings, the recovered handbag and clothing, the bloodstained crowbar, and a detailed, corroborated confession, was transferred to the public prosecutor. Hassan was formally charged with premeditated murder committed with ambush, the legal classification applied when a victim is taken entirely by surprise, along with concealment of a corpse and a string of related charges. The examining magistrate conducted his own exhaustive review, re-interviewing witnesses, re-verifying every piece of evidence, and summoning Hassan for multiple further rounds of formal questioning. Each time, Hassan confirmed his confession without deviation. He offered no defense beyond the same hollow refrain, "I did not mean to kill her." The trial, when it opened before the criminal chamber, drew considerable public attention. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with grief and judgment in equal measure. Samira's parents sat in the front row, her father's face a mask of rigid, anguished stoicism, her mother weeping quietly into a handkerchief. Tariq, the husband she had once divorced, was not present. He had rebuilt his life around raising their two daughters, and his absence spoke its own quiet sentence. A man who had long since made peace with a tragedy he could never have prevented. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous precision. The premeditation, they argued, was not contained in the single blow of the crowbar, but in the long pattern of behavior that preceded it. Hassan had stalked Samira. He had maneuvered his way into her family's trust. He had systematically isolated her from her husband, her children, and her parents. He had lied to her again and again, luring her back each time she tried to break free. The murder, the prosecution contended, was the inevitable and violent culmination of a sustained campaign of psychological control. When his final lie was exposed and his grip on her finally slipped, he answered with lethal force. The defense could mount little resistance. Hassan's lawyer pleaded for leniency, citing the absence of any premeditated plan to kill, the spontaneous nature of the fatal blow, and his client's otherwise clean record. But the court, having reviewed the full weight of the evidence, was unmoved. The pattern of stalking, manipulation, and calculated deceit painted the portrait of a predator, not a man who had merely lost his temper in a moment of passion. The verdict, delivered after months of hearings, was decisive. Hassan was found guilty on every count. The sentence, handed down in a courtroom heavy with emotion, was life imprisonment, law perpetuate, under the Moroccan Penal Code, for a murder committed with ambush and compounded by the concealment of a corpse. This was the justice the law demanded. The man who had once promised Samira a life of gold and comfort would now spend the remainder of his days behind cold concrete walls, with only the memory of what he had done for company. In the aftermath, as the case file was stamped and consigned to the archives, it left behind a residue of bitter, uncomfortable lessons. Samira had begun her story in a place of security and respectability. She had a loving husband, 2 beautiful daughters, a family that cared for her deeply. But she was seduced, not merely by a man, but by the illusion of a grander, more glamorous life. The predator who stalked her understood this instinctively. He knew her price, and he paid it in counterfeit promises. By the time she uncovered the truth, she had already burned every bridge behind her. She was isolated, trapped, and entirely dependent on the very man who would ultimately destroy her. And what of Tariq, the husband betrayed in the most intimate and devastating way imaginable? He rose from the wreckage with a quiet, dignified resilience. He took custody of his 2 daughters, settled them into the care of his mother, and slowly, patiently, rebuilt the life that had been shattered around him. He sought no revenge. He took no satisfaction in Hassan's downfall or in Samira's tragic end. He simply devoted himself to raising his children, shielding them from the darkness that had consumed their mother. In a story steeped in deception, greed, and violence, Tariq stands as a quiet rebuke, a reminder that true strength is not found in rage or retribution, but in steady, unglamorous devotion to those who depend on you. The captain, alone in the dim quiet of his office, the vintage microphone catching the weary cadence of his voice, leaned forward one final time to offer his closing reflection. This case was never about a single moment of violence. It is about the long, slow erosion of a person's judgment, manipulated by a man who knew precisely which strings to pull. Samira was not an innocent in the purest sense. She made choices, terrible choices, choices that wounded the people who loved her most. But she was also a victim, trapped by a predator who isolated her, lied to her, and then, when his lies finally collapsed, silenced her forever. The crowbar was only the last act in a tragedy that began long before, with a look, a whisper, and a promise that was never real. Let this be a warning. The most dangerous predators are rarely the ones who break down your door. They're the ones who charm their way in, sit at your table, and, slowly and quietly, take apart everything you hold dear. And so we close the file on another dark chapter from the Moroccan crime archives. A story of a modest family, a predatory obsession, and a young woman who traded everything solid for a handful of glittering lies, only to pay the ultimate price for it. If you found this case compelling, hit the like button, subscribe to English Crime Files, and share your theories in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next case.